We remember them as invincible cowboys, sophisticated villains, and the defining faces of American television. But behind the glamour of mid-century Hollywood, a deeply normalized habit was quietly sealing their fates. Today, we are looking at 10 famous Hollywood actors who died from lung cancer. From a beloved sitcom pioneer who built an empire under crushing stress to a legendary movie star who literally warned America from beyond the grave. Who were these enduring icons, and how did the era they defined ultimately cost them everything? Number 1. Paul Newman. Paul Newman spent most of his adult life trying to convince people to look past his eyes. It was a strange problem to have, but for a guy who wanted to be taken seriously as an actor, being the most handsome man in the room was almost a liability. He was deeply uncomfortable with the idol worship that came with movies like The Hustler and HUD. By the time he reached his 70s, he had finally won that battle. The rebellious anti-hero of the 1960s had aged smoothly into a respected elder statesman of American cinema. He built a massive food company just to give all the profits away to charity. He maintained a 50-year marriage to Joanne Woodward. In a town famous for chewing people up, Newman figured out how to survive it. He kept his private life actually private. But surviving Hollywood doesn't mean you can outrun the era you lived in. Newman came of age in a studio system where a cigarette was practically a required prop. Directors used the smoke to catch the lighting to add texture to a scene to make a character look tough or thoughtful or weary. It was just a part of the uniform for a leading man of his generation. Decades later, the physical toll of those early heavily normalized habits eventually caught up with him. When his health began to definitively decline in his early 80s, he managed the situation exactly the way you would expect. He didn't make a grand announcement. There were no dramatic magazine covers. He simply stepped away from the cameras, quietly closed the door on a 50-year acting career, and chose to spend his remaining time at home in Connecticut, surrounded by his family. He passed away in the fall of 2008 at the age of 83. The focus at the time wasn't really on the illness that took him, but on the sheer scale of the life he had lived. He showed an entire generation of audiences that it was possible to hold on to your dignity even when the whole world is watching you. Number 2. Yul Brynner. Yul Brynner built an entire career on the illusion of absolute authority. Whether he was playing the King of Siam on a Broadway stage or a relentless black-clad gunslinger in The Magnificent Seven, he carried a commanding, almost intimidating posture. When Brynner walked into a frame, he owned the room. He didn't just play leaders, he demanded that the audience believe he was untouchable. Audiences in the 1950s and 60s completely bought into that invincibility. And part of that tough masculine image both on screen and off was a heavy, persistent smoking habit. It wasn't something hidden from the public. It was a widely accepted, even celebrated part of celebrity culture at the time. Brynner smoked multiple packs a day for decades, starting long before the general public fully grasped the long-term consequences. But what makes Brynner's story so distinct from his contemporaries isn't how his health declined in the mid-1980s. It's exactly what he did with the time he had left. Knowing his diagnosis was terminal, Brynner didn't retreat behind the closed doors of a Hollywood estate. Instead, he chose to leverage his famously authoritative voice one last time. He sat down with the American Cancer Society and filmed an incredibly stark, direct commercial. There were no elaborate sets, no costumes, and no dramatic lighting. It was just a man looking straight into the lens telling the American public, "Now that I'm gone, I tell you don't smoke." It was a jarring piece of television. Viewers simply weren't used to seeing their screen idols confront their own mortality so bluntly, let alone use their death to make a point. The commercial was specifically designed to air after he passed away in the fall of 1985 at the age of 65. It was a brilliant, deliberate use of his own fame. Brynner understood the mechanics of his public image perfectly. He knew people would pay attention if the King of Siam gave them an order. By willingly dismantling his own myth of invincibility, he delivered a warning that resonated far deeper than any traditional Hollywood farewell ever could. Number 3. Dean Martin. Dean Martin made a fortune by convincing the American public that he wasn't really trying. The tuxedo, the half-empty glass in one hand, the cigarette casually wedged between his fingers, it wasn't just a casual habit. It was a highly calibrated, immensely profitable brand. As the undisputed king of cool and the anchor of the Rat Pack, Martin sold a fantasy of effortless indulgence. On his wildly successful television variety show in the 1960s, he would slide down a fireman's pole or stroll across the stage looking like he had just wandered in from a great party. The smoke drifting up around the microphone was as essential to his performance as his velvet baritone voice. It signaled a kind of masculine relaxation that men wanted to emulate and audiences found endlessly charming. Interestingly, a lot of that famous onstage persona was a carefully maintained illusion. Industry insiders knew that the amber liquid in his glass was often just apple juice. He was actually far more disciplined and professional than his tipsy Playboy image suggested. But the cigarettes were entirely real. In mid-century show business, smoking wasn't just a personal choice. It was the accepted atmospheric backdrop of the entire entertainment industry. The lounges, the casinos, the television sets, they were all clouded in it. For decades, Martin leaned heavily into that late-night aesthetic. But you can't embody the mid-century party forever. As the decades rolled on, the culture around him shifted significantly, and the physical reality of his long-term habits quietly caught up with his stamina. The very props that helped build his unflappable, relaxed persona ultimately compromised his physical endurance. When his health began to definitively decline in the early 1990s, he didn't seek the spotlight or ask for public sympathy. The energetic Vegas stages and crowded television studios were replaced by quiet, solitary dinners at familiar restaurants in Beverly Hills. He stepped back without fanfare, letting the public keep their memories of the tuxedo and the charm. He passed away on Christmas Day in 1995 at the age of 78. His departure felt like turning off the lights on a glamorous bygone era, leaving behind an enduring television image that was as captivating as it was physically costly. Number 4. Desi Arnaz. When audiences in the 1950s looked at Desi Arnaz, they saw Ricky Ricardo. They saw a charismatic bandleader with a quick temper, a charming accent, and an endless supply of patience for his wife's comedic schemes. But behind the camera, the reality was entirely different. Desi Arnaz wasn't just a sitcom actor, he was one of the most brilliant high-strung executives in the history of American television. When he and Lucille Ball launched I Love Lucy, they essentially had to invent the modern television industry to get it on the air. Desi pioneered the 3-camera setup, fought the network to shoot on high-quality film instead of cheap kinescope, and practically invented the concept of the television rerun, just to keep their production company afloat. Building the Desilu empire was an exhausting, high-stakes gamble. He was managing massive production budgets, negotiating with aggressive studio heads, and carrying the weight of the most popular show in the country on his shoulders. In the pressure cooker environment of 1950s, television production smoking wasn't just a social habit. For executives like Desi, it was a constant nervous mechanism to cope with relentless stress. Whether he was pacing the sound stages, arguing in the boardroom, or reviewing scripts late into the night, a cigarette was almost permanently attached to his hand. The same relentless drive that allowed him to build a Hollywood empire also fueled a physical dependency that he simply couldn't shake even long after he had sold his share of the studio and stepped away from the daily grind of the industry. Years of heavy smoking eventually compromised his health. By the mid-1980s, the physical reality of those stressful chain-smoking decades at the helm of Desilu caught up with him. He spent his final years quietly far removed from the frantic pace of the television networks he helped establish. He passed away in the winter of 1986 at the age of 69. People remember him primarily for the laughs and the music, but his story is a stark reminder of the immense physical and personal cost required to revolutionize an entire industry from the ground up. Number 5. Vincent Price. Vincent Price built a 50-year career terrifying audiences, yet in real life he was far more likely to be found lecturing on fine art or writing a gourmet cookbook than lurking in a haunted mansion. He held a degree in art history from Yale and was a highly respected collector. But Hollywood quickly realized that his tall, aristocratic posture and elegantly theatrical voice were absolutely perfect for playing cultured, sophisticated villains. Price embraced the macabre completely. He understood exactly what the audience wanted, bringing a sense of wry, campy elegance to thrillers throughout the 1960s and 70s. He became a fixture in American pop culture, seamlessly transitioning from low-budget drive-in movies to daytime game shows like The Hollywood Squares, and eventually lending his unmistakable baritone to Michael Jackson's Thriller. He was a genuine intellectual who simply loved being an entertainer. Like many actors who transitioned from the mid-century theater stage to the grueling schedules of studio filmmaking, smoking was a persistent background element of his daily routine. A cigarette, often held with a practiced theatrical flourish, fit perfectly with the image of the urbane, slightly sinister gentleman he frequently portrayed on screen. It was a stylistic choice that blended perfectly into the glamorous aesthetic of the era, long before the long-term medical realities were fully acknowledged by the public or the industry. Eventually, the cumulative physical cost of those years took its toll. In the early 1990s, the booming resonant voice that had chilled and delighted generations of moviegoers began to lose its power. As his stamina faded and his breathing became labored, he quietly withdrew from the public eye. He retreated from the recording booths and sound stages to the quiet comfort of his home, surrounded by the art collection he had spent a lifetime curating. He passed away in the fall of 1993 at the age of 82. The cultural footprint he established goes far beyond the horror genre. He proved to the industry that you could make a very serious, highly respected living out of simply not taking yourself too seriously. Number 6. Robert Mitchum. Robert Mitchum didn't just play the cinematic rebel, he practically invented the blueprint for it. Years before James Dean put on a red jacket or Marlon Brando rode a motorcycle, Mitchum was already dominating the screen with heavy eyelids, a trench coat, and an attitude of complete indifference. He was the defining face of film noir in the 1940s and 50s. In movies like Out of the Past, the cigarette was never just something to do with his hands. It was a crucial piece of the cinematic vocabulary. Directors used the smoke swirling around his face to signal danger, cynicism, and a weary understanding of a corrupt world. The public loved him exactly because he seemed completely unbothered by the polished, restrictive rules of the studio system. He even survived a highly publicized 1948 narcotics arrest, a scandal that would have instantly destroyed any other career at the time. Instead, it only made his anti-hero image feel more authentic. But that reckless, nonchalant lifestyle wasn't just a performance for the cameras. Mitchum lived exactly as he appeared. He was famously dismissive of acting as an art form, often joking that his only real technique was keeping his eyes open and hitting his marks. Yet that casual dismissal masked a heavy reliance on the very habits that built his on-screen persona. In the mid-century Hollywood ecosystem, chain smoking was the absolute baseline for a tough guy, and Mitchum fully embodied that standard for decades. He was a man who seemed entirely bulletproof, surviving shifting industry trends, changing public tastes, and his own chaotic off-screen life. Yet, the physical reality of his generation's deeply ingrained habits is entirely indifferent to a tough guy reputation. By the late 1990s, the slow accumulating toll of those years caught up with his famously sturdy constitution. His imposing physical presence faded, and he quietly stepped away from the industry he had always pretended not to care about. He passed away in the summer of 1997, just weeks before his 80th birthday. The industry lost a giant, a man who proved that sometimes the most enduring Hollywood stars are the ones who flatly refuse to play by Hollywood's rules. Number 7. Betty Grable. In the 1940s, 20th Century Fox famously insured Betty Grable's legs for $1 million. It was a brilliant piece of publicity, but it essentially reduced the highest-paid female star in America to a single marketable commodity. When you look at her iconic over-the-shoulder pinup photo, the one that traveled overseas with millions of American she projects an effortless, radiant optimism. But behind the camera, generating that effortless sunshine was exhausting. Grable was carrying the financial weight of an entire movie studio. Starring in those lavish Technicolor musicals meant enduring, punishing 12-hour days. It was a relentless cycle of vocal recordings, complicated dance rehearsals, and endless takes under intensely hot studio lighting. In the mid-century studio system, actors weren't really given the space to complain about burnout. To manage the immense pressure, the physical exhaustion, and the strict weight requirements demanded by the wardrobe department, Grable relied on the most common, socially acceptable tool available. Smoking was ubiquitous on every Hollywood soundstage. For a heavily overworked contract player, a cigarette offered a rare 5-minute break from the chaos, a way to steady the nerves before the cameras started rolling again. She gave everything to maintain her position at the box office, smiling through the physical fatigue for over a decade. But the habits that helped her survive the brutal demands of her peak years eventually compromised her entirely. Unlike many of the actors from her era who eased into long, quiet retirements, Grable's time was cut significantly shorter. Her health deteriorated rapidly in her mid-50s, pulling her away from the theater and television appearances she had successfully transitioned into. She passed away in the summer of 1973 at the age of only 56. The public will always prefer to remember the cheerful, morale-boosting icon of the Second World War. But her early departure is a stark reminder of the massive physical toll exacted by a Hollywood machine that demanded absolute perfection and rarely cared what it cost the person providing it. Number 8. Chuck Connors. At 6'6" with a jawline that looked like it was carved out of granite, Chuck Connors was built for stadiums. Before he ever picked up a prop Winchester rifle, he was a professional athlete playing in both the NBA and Major League Baseball. When he transitioned to acting, he brought that massive, undeniable physical presence directly into American living rooms. In the late 1950s, network television was completely saturated with westerns, and Connors quickly claimed his territory as Lucas McCain on The Rifleman. He wasn't just playing a cowboy, he was projecting a highly idealized version of mid-century fatherhood. He was stern, fair protective, and morally absolute. Week after week, audiences tuned in to watch a man who seemed entirely unshakable, an anchor of traditional masculinity in a rapidly changing country. But the reality of producing a weekly network western was anything but steady. The production schedules in the late 50s and early 60s were notoriously brutal. Actors were shooting dozens of episodes a season, spending long, exhausting hours on dusty backlots under the relentless California sun. For an ex-athlete navigating the grinding demands of the television industry, the constant pressure required an outlet. Much like the rest of the country during that era, Connors was a heavy, persistent smoker. It was an accepted, almost expected habit for a working man of his generation, a daily routine that was completely disconnected from the strict athletic discipline that had defined his early career. For decades, his towering frame easily masked the physical toll of those deeply ingrained habits. He continued working steadily through the 70s and 80s, racking up dozens of television and film credits. He still looked like the toughest, most capable guy in the room. Eventually, the biological reality of those years caught up with his famously durable constitution. When his breathing and stamina began to fail in the early 1990s, the physical decline of such an imposing figure was difficult for audiences to reconcile. He spent his final months quietly far removed from the rugged landscapes he used to dominate on television. He passed away in the fall of 1992 at the age of 71. Today, he remains a permanent fixture of television syndication, forever frozen in time as the immovable moral center of the Western frontier. Number 9. George Peppard. If you look at the arc of George Peppard's career, you see a strange and fascinating pivot. In the early 1960s, he was the picture of refined Hollywood elegance, standing in the rain opposite Audrey Hepburn in Breakfast at Tiffany's. He was groomed to be a classic romantic leading man. Yet, if you ask any television viewer in the 1980s who George Peppard was, they won't mention Audrey Hepburn. They will instantly picture a grinning mercenary with a shock of white hair and a massive cigar clamped firmly between his teeth. As Colonel John Hannibal Smith on the A-Team Peppard found the role that would permanently define his career. The cigar wasn't just a casual addition to the character, it was a central piece of the show's visual branding. Every time an explosive, chaotic plan worked out exactly right, Hannibal would light up, smile, and deliver his famous catchphrase. The smoke was a symbol of absolute confidence of a guy who always had the upper hand. But that highly visible on-screen prop was just an extension of a deeply entrenched reality. Peppard was a heavy lifelong smoker, a habit forged back in the mid-century studio days where a cigarette was just a standard part of an actor's daily routine. Over the decades, the habit simply carried over from the glamorous film sets of the 60s to the dusty, action-packed television backlots of the 80s. Eventually, the bill for those decades of heavy smoking came due. In 1992, a serious diagnosis forced him to confront the physical toll of his lifestyle. Peppard actually did what many find impossible. He completely gave up smoking. But stepping away from a lifelong habit in your 60s rarely reverses the long-term damage already done to the body. His health steadily declined over the next 2 years, pulling him away from the active, commanding roles he loved to play. He passed away quietly in the spring of 1994 at the age of 65. The public had spent years watching him play a tactical genius who could survive any impossible situation, making it surprisingly difficult to accept that the man behind the cigar was just as vulnerable as anyone else. Number 10. Suzanne Pleshette. Long before she ever stepped onto a television set, Suzanne Pleshette had a voice that could completely control a room. It was throaty, sarcastic, and undeniably sophisticated. While other actresses in the 1960s were heavily pressured into playing bubbly, naive ingenues, Pleshette always sounded like she already knew the punchline to a joke you hadn't finished telling. When she took on the role of Emily Hartley on the Bob Newhart Show in the 1970s, she quietly redefined what a television wife could be. She wasn't just standing in the kitchen waiting for her husband to come home. She was an independent, deeply cynical, and incredibly funny professional. A massive part of that sharp, sardonic appeal was anchored in her unmistakable husky delivery. But that signature sound didn't exist in a vacuum. It was the direct byproduct of a persistent, lifelong smoking habit. For Pleshette, and for many women navigating the mid-century entertainment industry, a cigarette was a widely accepted tool of sophistication. It signaled a kind of worldly independence and an edge that cut straight through the highly restrictive expectations of Hollywood glamour. She carried that habit with her from the tense, demanding sets of Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds straight through to her reign on primetime television. She was notoriously blunt in real life, known within the industry for her sharp wit and her absolute refusal to take the celebrity machine too seriously. So, when her health definitively turned in 2006, she handled the diagnosis with exactly the kind of tough, unsentimental pragmatism you would expect from her. She didn't ask for public sympathy or attempt to dramatize her situation for the press. She simply navigated the grueling medical realities, privately leaning heavily on her close circle of friends and her famously dark sense of humor. She passed away in the winter of 2008 at the age of 70, just days before she was scheduled to receive a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. Her departure marked the quiet end of a distinctly elegant, razor-sharp era of American television. We will always remember the flawless comedic timing, but it remains impossible to ignore the steep physical cost of the very lifestyle that helped build her iconic image.